Hi, my name is Kelvin. I'm a PhD student with Imperial, NCEO, and the Grantham Institute. The reduced economic activity during the COVID-19 lockdown has given us some of the rare opportunities to study the unusual co-benefits of dramatic changes in air quality. In this talk, we'll look at what we can learn from the lockdown in terms of solar energy resources. We'll specifically be looking at the technology found in commercial solar farms, highly efficient multi-junction solar cells in concentrator photovoltaic systems. And there are two key things you need to know about them. First of all, due to their optics, they can only accept the direct normal irradiance or DNI components of the sunlight. And second, more importantly, they're more spectrally sensitive than conventional single junction solar cells. And therefore, their energy yields are particularly susceptible to atmospheric changes. For example, due to air pollution over Beijing, spectral changes can lead to a 30% annual loss in electricity generation potential. So it'll be interesting to see whether the cleaner atmosphere during the lockdown has recovered some, if any, of this loss. This talk will be split into three parts. Using satellite observations, we first look at changes in solar energy relevant species over China. We then simulate changes in the spectral direct normal irradiance or DNI. And finally, we feed these simulated spectra into a solar cell simulator and look at the impact lockdown has on its performance. So let's get started. And we'll specifically be looking at two species that are relevant to solar energy applications. The first one being nitrogen dioxide or NO2. For NO2, we will use monthly averaged NO2 measurements from Shapomi. The bottom plots here show the monthly average for the first 4 months of 2020. And the top row shows the same period in the 2019 year. Now, we have to be careful when we select a baseline to compare the lockdown against, because we have to consider things like seasonal changes, as well as the kind of staggered lockdown timeline over China. There's also the Chinese Lunar New Year holiday, which would have seen reductions in anthropogenic air pollutions regardless of the lockdown measures. So considering all these kind of constraints, we have selected the months of February and March in 2019 and 2020 as our main investigation periods. Now, between these two periods, we can see remarkable reductions in NO2 all across China. The reductions are a bit more kind of apparent in this plot, where we show and compare differences over major Chinese cities by population. We see consistent decrease in NO2 for all these locations, and Wuhan, where the pandemic first emerged, saw a whopping 75% drop. You can see reductions anywhere between 25 to 50% for a large number of cities as well. It's no secret that this reduction in NO2 level has been attributed to a drop in fossil fuel-based activity, things like road traffic, industries, power plants, aviation, and so on. So that's NO2, and now let's turn to aerosols, which is particularly important for solar panels. Aerosols are suspended particles and droplets in the atmosphere, and we'll use AOD, aerosol optical depth measurements from MODIS, for this particular work we're doing here. Here we see the AOD differences for the two time periods, as well as the percentage change on the right-hand side. Now you can see the variation is quite a bit less uniform across China compared to the changes we saw earlier for NO2. In fact, when we see reductions over central China, AOD actually increased in the southwest and northeast. Similar to NO2, we can compare AOD changes over major cities in China. While some, like Wuhan, saw reductions, the AOD actually increased for some other cities, like Beijing. Now, given the kind of high variability of AOD, the variety of aerosol sources, and the complex relationships between aerosols and local meteorology, I will not attempt to directly attribute the changes we see here to the lockdown measures. But regardless, these are the things we see and the changes we saw for NO2 and aerosols. And now, given these changes, we will try to simulate what solar panels will see given these variations. We'll specifically be using a spectral DNI estimation scheme, which I've been working on as part of my PhD work. At its core, it's a radiated transfer calculation, but the scheme takes into account things that are relevant to solar energy application, things like circumsolar irradiance and better handling of the effects of aerosols spectrally. We'll feed all the columnar observations from satellites that we've been talking about into the scheme, as well as their profiles and profiles of other species from ECMWF cams. To begin, we'll first focus on Wuhan as a case study to discuss our simulation results before moving on to other locations all around China. This shows the simulated DNI over Wuhan. Blue is for lockdown this year, and red is the same time period for last year. The broadband DNI available during the lockdown is 19% higher compared to the same time period in 2019. Now, this is not particularly surprising. I mean, given the reductions in NO2 and AOD over Wuhan. There's just less stuff in the atmosphere in the way to absorb and scatter sunlight. But looking at the spectra on the left-hand side, though, we see that most of the gain actually happens at the shorter wavelengths, meaning there's a blue shift in the solar spectrum. Here we break down the 19% gain in DNI into individual contributions. Aerosol, which is shown in green here, is the most significant, accounting for 61 watt per meter square. NO2 in orange contributes another 6, and the remaining contributions are shown in purple. This term, this residual term, encompasses everything other than NO2 and aerosol. So, for example, Wuhan was just so happened to be more humid during the 2020 period, so we see increased water vapor absorption. Along with the effects of other species, they collectively attenuate the DNI by 6.5 watt per meter square. Now, this seems to suggest that the gain due to NO2 reduction has been more than offset by the reduction in DNI due to all other contributions, but that's actually not the case spectrally. In fact, you can see that the increase in DNI due to NO2 changes is manifested at shorter wavelengths, while reduction takes place at longer wavelengths. This kind of spectral separation is particularly important for solar cell, multi-junction solar cell performance, which we'll talk about now. So we now pass all these simulated spectra into a solar cell simulator called SOCOR. The main thing here we want to simulate is something called the maximum power point. Now, in general, the maximum power point, you can think of it as kind of the power output of the solar panel. And in general, the maximum power point varies linearly with sunlight intensity. So previously, we said the broadband DNI increased by 19%. So maybe the power output also increased by 19%, right? Well, not quite. Otherwise, otherwise it's not a very interesting talk. In fact, we estimate that for a triple junction solar cell in concentrator photovoltaic systems, the maximum power point actually increased by 30%, almost 30%. Now, of this 30%, 19 is due to the broadband DNI intensity increase, so that's fine. But the additional 10%, on the other hand, is due to something we'll call the spectral contribution, or the spectral effect. Now, it's worth taking a step back and actually briefly understand the contribution, the spectral contribution, and the origin of this contribution. We'll use something perhaps a bit more familiar to everyone, which is TV remotes. I'm sure we can all relate to the frustration of dealing with batteries in TV remotes. The remotes stop working if one of the batteries die, even if all the other ones are completely fine and fully charged. This is because the overall output of the stack of battery is limited by the weakest cell. This phenomenon is called current limiting. And you can think of solar panels as kind of stacked layers of batteries as well. So this is an example of a commercially available triple junction solar cell. You can see 3 layers of semiconductor, InGaP, InGaAs, and germanium for the bottom layer. And each layer has been engineered and designed to absorb a very specific slice of the solar spectrum. Now, when these kind of cells operate under polluted urban environment, like most of China, it's usually the case that the top cell, the InGaP layer, is the current limiting one. You can think of it as the weakest battery in that TV remote, let's say, right? Now, this layer just so happens to be also the one responsible for absorbing the shortest wavelength amongst the stack. And so therefore, when there's a blue shift in the DNI spectrum, it's kind of effectively kind of giving a boost, a kick to the weakest layer of the cell stack, and thus increasing the overall performance of the system. Also shown here is the absorption cross-section in red of NO2. You can see spectrally aligns quite well with the spectral response of the top layer. And so, in other words, all the changes of NO2 that we've seen will be disproportionately kind of amplified because of the spectral effect, um, um, as far as the kind of the power output of the solar cell is concerned. Here we show the breakdown of contributions to the maximum power point. We can see both broadband and spectral contributions here. Now for NO2, the broadband contribution is only 1.7 watt per meter square. However, the spectral contribution is an additional 2 watt per meter square. In other words, the spectral effect, which we've been talking about, has been basically doubled the NO2's contribution to the total power output. You can see similar effects for aerosols as well. Now, another way to think about spectral effects is in terms of solar cell efficiency. Our solar cell has been optimized against a standard spectrum. So this is an example of the standard spectrum from ASTM. And our cell is optimized against it. And the atmosphere in which this standard has been based on assumes no NO2, rural aerosol type with minimal aerosol loading. And the cell operates at peak efficiency under the illumination of the spectrum, and deviation from this will reduce the efficiency. Polluted environments and polluted urban environments like the ones we find over Wuhan before lockdown really put our solar cell system under very unfavorable operating conditions. However, the cleaner atmosphere during the lockdown is something closer to the standard atmosphere, and therefore the cell efficiency has been improved. In fact, the efficiencies were 30 and 32% before and after the lockdown, based on an estimation. That's pretty incredible, right? Again, like just remind you, like we are looking at exactly the same solar cell design, right? Exactly identical solar cell, just operating under two different atmospheres with different NO2 concentration and AODs, and the efficiency differs by 2.6%, simply due to the spectral matching and the spectral effect. So finally, we expand our analysis to all across China. Here on the top row, we see the estimated broadband DNI for 2019 and 2020 periods. Most regions saw increases in DNI with percentage enhancements over 100% for some of these pixels. The areas experiencing the most substantial increase are clustered around central China, consistent with areas where we saw the most significant decrease in NO2 and aerosols. At the bottom, we have the estimated solar cell efficiency for a triple-junction CPV system. It follows the kind of similar geospatial pattern as the changes for DNI. But you can see that actually from the percentage changes that the 2.6% change we saw over Wuhan is far from the most extreme case. In fact, over central China, we estimate that some of the solar cell efficiency increased by up to 14%. So to conclude, we see dramatic changes in NO2 and aerosols over China during lockdown from satellite observations. This led to an increase in broadband DNI at ground, as well as a blue shift in the solar spectrum, which in turn make multi-junction CPV systems operate more efficiently. Now, it's most likely that the changes in emissions are temporary as we emerge from lockdown. All this allows us to better understand how changes in air pollution can impact solar energy resources in general. In fact, we'll notice that the approximately 35% drop in NO2 observed during the lockdown is roughly the same magnitude one would expect between some of the projected scenarios within the shared socioeconomic pathway frameworks. Therefore, we would expect that the work we're doing here will be important in the future in terms of air pollution policies and climate change mitigation. And particularly, I want to point out the kind of potential hidden benefits of a cleaner atmosphere for more efficient, and efficient is a key word here, large-scale solar energy generation. Now, to end this talk, I will do something a bit different. I will try to introduce you to a Chinese saying, which is 四半功倍. 半 means half, and 倍 means double. This Chinese phrase eloquently captures the idea of how when you work more efficiently, you can get twice as much done with just half the effort. And this headline newspaper clipping back in February in China, I mean, it was using this phrase in the context of, how by harnessing big data infrastructure, we can fight the pandemic more effectively. But in the context of solar energy, the lockdown really has shown us the reduced air pollution is also 事半功倍. I mean, it's hard work to clean up the atmosphere in general, but when we do, not only do we get more sunlight for our solar panels, the panels themselves also get more efficient and do more work for us. Now, it's not quite half the work and double the outcome, but for Wuhan, maybe perhaps we can say it's 19% the effort, but 30% of the output, and that's not too bad, right? And I think that's one of the kind of lessons we can learn from the COVID-19 lockdown as far as our solar energy resources are concerned.